I'm KT McFarland. I was the junior-most member of Dr. Kissinger's National Security Council staff beginning in the earliest years of the Nixon administration. Ambassador Winston Lord, the senior-most member of his staff, and I conducted a series of interviews with Dr. Kissinger in his New York office. We talked about the major foreign policy achievements of the Nixon-Kissinger partnership, including the opening to China, the Vietnam Peace Accords, détente and arms control with the Soviet Union, and Middle East shuttle diplomacy. Like Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger didn't see foreign policy only as bilateral relationships between two countries, but as grand strategy, where one move on the global chessboard has second and third order effects, half a world away and for years to come. Now, in these short excerpts from our hours of interviews, here's Henry Kissinger in his own words.
Nixon thought of foreign policy as grand strategy. That foreign policy was the improvement of the relationship of countries to each other, that balancing of their self-interest would promote peace and the security of the United States. And I haven't studied any other American president who thought of it in such conceptual and such long-range terms. While Nixon was focusing on objectives, he did so in terms of the practical experiences that he had in meeting with leaders. My approach was very similar to his in terms of focusing on objectives. But the raw material for my thinking was historical and philosophical. I saw the world in terms of analogies to historical situations that I had studied and of the lessons one can draw from that. Our strategic objective was to prevent the Soviet Union from becoming the dominant country. The Soviet army had just occupied Czechoslovakia, and 42 Russian divisions appeared on the Chinese border, so that the use of Soviet military pressure was a feature of the Cold War world. Nixon began by opening arms control negotiations on strategic nuclear weapons. Our original plan was to use that summit with the Soviet Union to create additional incentives in China. But then the Soviet Union tried to, in effect, blackmail us with the prospect of a summit and dragged it on. So we reversed the process and said, okay, we'll go to China first. If you look at what Nixon said about China, he addressed the problem of China from the point of view of world order. His view was that by getting China involved in the international system, the whole pattern of international politics would be transformed, because all other countries would then have to consider the impact of China in terms of the new dispensation. And he calculated that then we might produce a situation in which America would be closer to most of the contestants than they were to each other, and therefore had a strong bargaining position. The second or third day in office, I looked at the war plans, and the expected consequences of a nuclear war were horrendous. So to say that we will not negotiate and we'll simply let these weapons pile up without ever being able to devise a strategy in which you could use them in a way that didn't destroy civilization, those were the impelling motives. The summit between Nixon and Brezhnev in 1972, occurring at a high point of the Vietnam War, demonstrated one of the main themes of the Nixon administration. We thought it outdoing, and we saw the possibility of negotiating agreements for world peace and to indicate specific steps towards it, and to combine these two actions in one relatively brief period of time of a month symbolizes the special nature of the foreign policy that Nixon conducted. We had always had the view that the breakthrough in negotiations would come when one of the Arab countries concluded that Soviet military support was not the way to achieve their objectives. And during the war, we managed to establish ourselves as mediators between the Arab and the Israeli side. The war had to be ended, and we had to do this in conjunction with the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union still had the major influence in the Arab world. And somebody had said that within a limited period of time, we're going to have a big array of negotiations with the Soviet Union after we have opened to China. People would have said this is an absolute fantasy. Any leader has the task of taking his society from where it is to where it has never been. And you need courage to walk alone part of the way.
Diplomat, author, historian, philosopher, Henry Kissinger is sought out by presidents and prime ministers, by businessmen, innovators, and entrepreneurs, by scholars and students and journalists, and even by ordinary citizens who recognize his great experience and value his judgment and wisdom. Separately, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger are great men. Working together, they were giants. That's why nearly half a century later, their White House years are considered a golden age of American diplomacy.